The copper stench of blood and wet earth filled the overturned carriage. Oliver lay pinned beneath splintered mahogany, waiting for the inevitable. He knew his wife. He knew Beatrice's greed. With his chest crushed and his breathing shallow, he waited for her to step over his dying body to salvage her jewel case from the wreckage. Instead, he felt soft, manicured hands frantically digging into the mud, tearing her own fingernails to the quick screaming his name with a ragged, feral terror that defied every cynical truth he believed about her. Pain was not a metaphor. It was a physical weight, a rusted iron spike driven through Oliver's ribcage and anchored in his spine. He drifted into consciousness on a wave of nausea, the taste of dirt and old pennies thick on his tongue. The world was pitched at a violent, unnatural angle. Above him, the rain drummed a relentless mocking rhythm against the shattered hull of the carriage. Somewhere in the dark, a horse was thrashing its hooves, kicking against the slick cobblestones of the embankment. Oliver tried to open his eyes, but his eyelashes were glued shut with something thick and tacky. Blood, his own presumably. He attempted a breath, and the resulting agony in his chest nearly sent him back into the blackness. A fractured rib. Maybe two. We crashed. The memory returned in disjointed flashes. The treacherous bend near the river. The sudden sickening snap of the front axle. The violent lurch, the sensation of weightlessness, and then the deafening crunch of wood and metal against stone. And Beatrice. She had been sitting across from him, swathed in absurdly expensive velvet, staring out the window, with that familiar hollow expression she wore like armor. They hadn't spoken since leaving the city. There was nothing left to say. Their marriage was a transaction completed 3 years ago, his title and fortune in exchange for saving her bankrupt aristocratic father from a debtor's prison. She had spent the ensuing years draining his accounts to furnish her drawing rooms and wardrobe, playing the perfect vapid Duchess of High Cross. He had spent them despising her. If she was alive, she was surely cursing him for the inconvenience of dying in the mud and ruining her Parisian skirts. A sharp scrape of debris dragging against rock pulled Oliver from his thoughts. Footsteps, heavy dragging, slipping in the mud. Oliver. The voice was unrecognizable. It was hoarse, stripped of the cultured, melodic lilt Beatrice meticulously maintained in London society. It sounded like an animal cornered in the dark. He didn't move. A strange, morbid curiosity seized him, overriding the screaming pain in his body. He let his muscles remain slack. He slowed his breathing, suppressing the urge to cough the blood out of his throat. He would give her this moment. He wanted to see what the parasite did when the host finally fell. He expected her to search his coat for the keys to the London townhouse, or perhaps pry the signet ring from his stiffening finger before the scavengers found them. Something heavy was hauled away from his chest. The splintered door of the carriage, soaked in rain, was tossed aside with a grunt of exertion that should have been impossible for a woman of her slight build. Then hands were on him. They weren't searching his pockets. They were clawing at the collar of his ruined cravat, ripping the thick silk with desperate force to expose his throat. Fingers trembling so violently, they bruised his skin pressed against the hollow of his neck. "Beat?" Oliver heard her whisper the word, catching on a sob. "Beat, damn you! Beat!" When she found his pulse, faint, thready, but there the sound that tore from her throat was not relief. It was rage. "Don't you dare!" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating just inches from his ear. He could smell her, not the suffocating rosewater perfume she usually wore, but sweat-wet wool and the sharp tang of fear. "Don't you dare leave me with this mess, Oliver. Open your eyes." He kept them shut. It took every ounce of his legendary stubbornness, the same iron will that had rebuilt his family's fortune, to remain limp. She gripped his shoulders, trying to pull him from the wreckage. It was useless. He outweighed her by 80 pounds, and his left leg was pinned beneath the collapsed seat. She slipped in the mud, falling hard against his chest. The impact sent a shockwave of white-hot pain through his broken ribs, and Oliver barely stifled a groan, turning it into a weak, unconscious exhale. "Help!" Beatrice screamed. It wasn't a lady's cry for assistance. It was a guttural roar echoing into the empty, rain-swept valley. "Somebody help us!" She scrambled off him. Oliver heard the tearing of fabric. A moment later, rough, heavy cloth was pressed against the gash on his forehead. She was binding his head wound. He felt the fabric. It was the velvet of her outer skirt torn by the yard and wrapped around his skull with clumsy, frantic tightness. "Stay alive, you stubborn bastard!" She muttered, her hand shaking as she tied the knot. Her knuckles brushed his cheek. They felt raw, wet, and sticky. She had torn her hands to pieces trying to dig him out. Why? The question echoed in the dark chamber of his mind, loud enough to momentarily drown out the pain. If he died here, she inherited the widow's portion. She would be free, wealthy, and pitied. It was everything a woman of her reputed calculating nature could want. Footsteps sloshed down the muddy bank. A lantern light bled through Oliver's closed eyelids, painting his vision in a hazy, dim red. "God above!" A man's voice called out, a local farmer, judging by the heavy, unrefined accent. "Is he dead?" "Your Grace." "No." Beatrice snapped. Her voice was suddenly lethal, devoid of tears. "He is alive. And if you stand there staring like a witless sheep, I will see you hanged. Help me lift this carriage." "My lady, that wood is too heavy." "I said lift it." Oliver felt the mud shift around him as the farmer joined Beatrice. The wood groaned, protesting against their combined weight. He felt her hands again slipping under his arms, hauling him backward through the muck with a strength born entirely of adrenaline. His ruined leg dragged over the splintered floorboards. The pain finally crested too massive for his mind to contain. As the blackness rushed up to claim him, the last thing he felt was Beatrice pulling his heavy, blood-soaked head into her lap, shielding his face from the freezing rain with her own body. Consciousness returned not with a rush, but with a slow, agonizing crawl. The first thing Oliver registered was the heat. It was dry and stifling. The scent of burning logs mingled with the sharp medicinal odor of camphor and eucalyptus. He was in a bed. The mattress was familiar, the absurdly soft goose down of his master suite at Highcross Manor. His body felt encased in lead. His ribs were tightly bound in stiff bandages that restricted his breathing to shallow sips. His left leg was immobilized, splinted, and resting on a mound of pillows. A dull, rhythmic pounding thudded behind his eyes, but the sharp, blinding agony of the crash had subsided into a heavy narcotic ache. Laudanum. They had drugged him. He kept his eyes closed instinctively, falling back on the deception he had begun in the mud. He needed to assess the room before declaring himself awake. The floorboards creaked, heavy measured steps. "I have done all I can, Your Grace." It was the pompous nasal voice of Dr. Arbuthnot, the physician the local gentry swore by. Oliver had always thought the man was a charlatan who charged exorbitant fees to prescribe leeches and prayers. "Which amounts to precisely nothing," Beatrice replied. Oliver's mental processes stuttered. He had expected her voice to be weary, perhaps veiled in faux mourning. Instead, it was flat, cold, dangerous. "My lady, you must prepare yourself." Arbuthnot said, his tone adopting that patronizing, syrupy quality physicians used on hysterical women. "The Duke's injuries are catastrophic. The trauma to the skull, the shattered femur. His breathing grows shallower by the hour. I have administered the laudanum to ease his passing. He will not wake again. He will likely not see the dawn." Oliver lay perfectly still. "So I am dying." The thought was strangely abstract, muffled by the opiates in his blood. He waited for Beatrice's reaction. A gasp, a polite sob into a handkerchief, a swift question regarding the presence of the family solicitor. Instead, he heard the sharp metallic click of a pocket watch snapping shut. "Get out," Beatrice said. "Pardon?" Arbuthnot stammered. "Get out." Her voice didn't rise, but it grew hard like frost forming on glass. "You stand in my husband's bedroom smelling of cheap brandy and tell me to prepare myself, while you do absolutely nothing to stitch the wounds or set the bone properly. You are a butcher in a tailored coat, Arbuthnot." "Your Grace, I assure you, standard medical practice dictates. Standard medical practice is why half of this county dies of minor infections." Beatrice cut him off. The rustle of heavy fabric indicated she was moving toward the door. If my husband dies tonight, it will be because the axle of his carriage was sawn half through, not because God willed it. And I will not have a useless drunkard lingering around his deathbed waiting to submit a bill. Leave this house immediately. If I see your face on High Cross land again, I will have the gamekeeper shoot you for trespassing. A prolonged, stunned silence hung in the room. Oliver could practically hear the doctor's indignation swelling. "You are hysterical, madame." Arbuthnot finally huffed his footsteps, retreating toward the heavy oak doors. "I shall leave you to your grief. May the Lord have mercy on his soul." The door opened and slammed shut. Oliver remained rigid, his mind racing, fighting the sluggishness of the drugs. The axle was sawn half through sabotage. Attempted murder. How did she know that, and why in God's name was she fighting the doctor who was trying to guarantee her an early, wealthy widowhood? He heard Beatrice cross the room. The soft padding of her stockinged feet approached the bed. He felt the mattress dip slightly as she sat on the edge near his hip. He expected her to sigh. He expected her to perhaps rifle through the drawer of his nightstand. Instead, a warm, damp cloth was pressed against his cheek. She dragged it gently over his jaw, wiping away the dried sweat and grime the physician had neglected. Her touch was incredibly careful, contrary to the viciousness she had just shown the doctor. "You cannot die, Oliver," she murmured. Her voice cracked, betraying the exhaustion she had hidden from Arbuthnot. She leaned closer. He could feel her breath against his ear. "If you die, they win?" She whispered, her words laced with a venomous bitterness. "Do you hear me? If you let go, that sniveling cousin of yours takes the entailment, and the man who ordered the carriage broken walks away with the estate's coffers. You have spent 3 years looking at me as if I am the worst thing that has ever happened to you. Do not let me be right about your lack of spine. Wake up and fight." She threw the damp cloth into a wash basin with a loud splash. Oliver's heart pounded against his bound ribs. That sniveling cousin, Thomas. Thomas stood to inherit the unentailed properties if Oliver died without an heir. But Thomas was a coward incapable of orchestrating a carriage sabotage, wasn't he? He felt a hand brush through his hair, untangling a knot clotted with dried blood. The gesture was shockingly tender, completely at odds with her harsh words. She lingered there, her fingers tracing the line of his scalp. "I cannot do this alone." She breathed the sound so fragile it made Oliver's chest ache worse than the broken bones. A single hot drop of moisture landed on his cheek. A tear. Beatrice, the ice queen of the London season, the woman who had coldly signed the marriage contract without a single blink, was crying over his broken body. He almost opened his eyes then. The urge to look at her, to see the face that matched this cracked, desperate voice, was overwhelming. But years of built-up cynicism held him back. If he woke now, the walls would instantly go back up. She would wipe her tears, adjust her posture, and revert to the polite, distant Duchess. He needed to know what she was hiding. He needed to know who was trying to kill him. He let out a low, ragged breath, shifting his head slightly, as if in deep sleep. Beatrice immediately pulled her hand away, the mattress shifting as she stood up. "I'll find them," she said to the empty room, her tone shifting from despair back to cold steel. "Rest, husband. I will guard the door." Night settled over High Cross Manor like a thick, suffocating blanket. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grand clock in the hallway and the occasional pop of the fireplace logs. Oliver's body was a landscape of agony. The laudanum was wearing off, replaced by a sharp, biting pain in his leg and a deep, throbbing ache in his chest. His muscles cramped from being entirely stationary for hours, but he forced himself to remain still, controlling his breathing with military precision. Through the sliver of space between his eyelashes, he watched her. Beatrice was seated at his heavy mahogany writing desk, positioned near the fireplace for warmth. The soft golden light of a single candelabra illuminated her face. She looked ruinous. The immaculate updos she favored were gone. Her dark hair hung in a tangled, loose mass over her shoulders. She wore a simple, uncorseted nightgown, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her thin frame. There were dark bruised smudges beneath her eyes, and a streak of dried mud remained near her jawline. She had dragged his heavy iron-bound strongbox from the corner of the room. It was the box where he kept his private ledgers, the coded accounts of his investments, and the estate's internal financial audits. Here it comes. Oliver thought a familiar bitter resignation settling over him. She dismissed the doctor to have the room to herself. She's looking for the bearer bonds. She's looking for the liquid assets. She had a ring of keys in her hand. He recognized them. They were his keys pulled from his ruined coat pocket. She slotted a heavy brass key into the strongbox. The lock clicked heavily. Oliver tensed, preparing to wake up and catch her in the act of looting him. But Beatrice didn't reach for the leather pouches of coin or the stack of bearer bonds resting on top. She unceremoniously shoved the money aside, digging deeper into the box until she pulled out 3 heavy leather-bound ledgers, his private account books. She slammed them onto the desk, uncorked his inkwell, and picked up a quill. For the next 2 hours, Oliver watched in stunned silence as his vapid, supposedly uneducated wife systematically audited the High Cross estate finances. She wasn't just skimming. She was cross-referencing pages, her eyes darting rapidly between columns of numbers. She muttered to herself, the scratch of the quill furious and sharp against the parchment as she took notes. Grain yields down 14% in the western quadrant. She whispered, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. But the shipping manifests from the river dock show an increase in exports. It doesn't match. Oliver's breath hitched. He had noticed the discrepancy 3 weeks ago. It was why he had been traveling to the city to hire a private investigator to look into his steward, a man named Harris who had served the family for 20 years. Oliver hadn't told a soul. Harris! Beatrice hissed the name like a curse. She violently flipped a page. You bloated, thieving swine! 3,000 pounds bled from the tenant repair funds over 2 years, funneled into the miscellaneous timber accounts. She leaned back in the chair, rubbing her temples, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. She turned her head to look at Oliver's still form in the bed. You missed it, Oliver, she said, her voice carrying across the quiet room. She wasn't mocking him. She sounded genuinely sorrowful. You were so busy looking at me like a thief you didn't notice the man holding the keys to the vault. Oliver felt a hot spike of shame pierce through the physical pain. It was true. He had spent the last 3 years scrutinizing Beatrice's dressmaker bills, convinced she was bleeding him dry while leaving the heavy estate management to Harris. Beatrice stood up from the desk, picking up a piece of parchment filled with her sharp, aggressive handwriting. She walked over to the bed, standing over him. Harris knew you were going to London to look into the accounts, she murmured, looking down at his bruised face. He knew you were getting close. That's why the carriage axle was cut. He paid the stable master to look the other way. I found the silver in the stable master's bunk while you were unconscious. Oliver's mind reeled. She had interrogated the staff, she had found the bribe. I always knew he was stealing. Beatrice continued, her voice trembling slightly. She reached out her fingers, lightly tracing the line of his bandaged ribs. I noticed the discrepancies in the household budget the first year we were married. I tried to tell you. Do you remember? Oliver searched his memory. 2 years ago. A rainy Tuesday in the breakfast room. Beatrice had approached him with an account book. He had barely looked up from his newspaper, sneering at her, asking if she needed more allowance for her hats, and telling her to leave the men's work to him and Harris. The memory tasted like bile in his throat. You looked at me with such disgust, she whispered, pulling her hand back and wrapping the shawl tighter around herself. You assumed I was asking for money. You always assumed the worst of me. My father sold me to you to pay his gambling debts, Oliver. You thought because I carry his name, I carry his rot. She turned away, walking back to the fire. She stared into the flames, her silhouette sharp and rigid against the light. I let you believe it. She admitted the confession ringing hollow in the grand room. It was easier to be the vapid, greedy Duchess you expected than to beg for the respect you were never going to give me. But I won't let them kill you, and I won't let Harris steal what belongs to this estate. She picked up the ledger again. Tomorrow I am calling the magistrate. I have the proof. I will see Harris hang. She paused, looking back at him, her eyes dark and wet. You just have to live long enough to see it. Please, Oliver, just live." Oliver lay in the dim light, the agonizing throbbing of his body entirely eclipsed by the shattering of his world view. The woman he had treated with cold, indifferent cruelty for 3 years wasn't a parasite. She was a fortress, and she was currently the only thing standing between him and the men who wanted him dead. He slowly, deliberately allowed his left hand to twitch against the bed sheets. It was time to wake up. The twitch of his fingers against the linen sheets felt like lifting boulders. Oliver drew a breath. He didn't mask the resulting groan. It tore out of his throat a pathetic rusted sound that tasted of bile and copper. The scratching of the quill at the desk stopped instantly. The heavy silence in the room stretched until it was brittle enough to snap. Then the frantic rustle of skirts. The smell of cold ash and lavender rushed toward him as Beatrice fell to her knees beside the bed. Oliver peeled his eyes open. The dim candlelight seared his retinas. Blinking through the haze, he found her face hovering above his. The fierce, terrifying competence she had displayed with the ledgers was gone, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed shock. Her lips were parted, trembling slightly. Oliver. The word was a breath fragile and afraid to hope. He tried to speak, but his tongue was a dry block of wood in his mouth. He swallowed the movement, sending a fresh spike of agony through his collarbone. "Water!" he rasped. She moved faster than he had ever seen her move. She poured water from the pitcher into a glass, her hands shaking so badly that the rim rattled against the crystal. Slipping her arm beneath his shoulders, she hoisted him up. The shift in his broken ribs made his vision white out. He gritted his teeth, a harsh hiss escaping him as she tipped the glass to his lips. The water was stale and lukewarm, but it felt like salvation. He drank greedily, coughing when it caught in his dry throat. "Slowly," she commanded. It was an order, but her voice cracked. She lowered him back against the pillows, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second against his clammy forehead, before she snatched it away. Oliver watched her retreat to the foot of the bed. The transformation was instantaneous. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and pulled the heavy wool shawl tightly around her nightgown, burying the raw, weeping woman from the carriage wreck beneath the impenetrable armor of the Duchess of Highcross. "You are awake," she stated. Her tone was carefully neutral, wiped clean of the desperate tears she had shed over him hours ago. "I shall send for Arbuthnot. Though he is an incompetent fool, he can at least change your bandages." "No." The word scraped out of him. Beatrice paused her hand on the brass doorknob. She looked over her shoulder, her dark eyes guarded. "You require a physician, Oliver. Your leg is shattered. Your head is bleeding." "I require—" He took a shallow, painful breath. "No, Arbuthnot." He saw the tension in her jaw. She was waiting for him to snap at her, to demand his valet to order her out of his sight. It was what he had done for 3 years whenever he was indisposed. Instead, he turned his head slowly on the pillow, his gaze locking onto the iron-bound strongbox and the scattered ledgers on the desk. Beatrice followed his line of sight. A flush of pink crept up her pale neck. She had been caught digging through his private affairs. In the old days yesterday, this would have ignited a screaming match. He would have accused her of counting his coin before he was cold. She would have called him a paranoid tyrant. "I was looking for the estate seal." She lied, her chin tilting a fraction higher. Her voice was ice. "To send official word to your solicitor." Oliver stared at her. He felt the phantom touch of her fingers in his hair, heard the echo of her voice promising to see his enemies hang. He was a cynical man, bred in a society built on polite fictions, but the lie sitting between them now felt utterly suffocating. "Did you find it?" he asked softly. Beatrice blinked, clearly thrown by the lack of venom in his voice. "No. Second drawer down, right side." Oliver closed his eyes, the effort of staying awake pulling him back toward the dark. Don't call the doctor. Bolt the door." He heard the sharp intake of her breath. To bolt the door was to isolate them, to lock out the staff, the doctors, the world. It was a declaration of trust he had never not once offered her. For a long moment there was no sound save the popping of the fire. Then the heavy iron bolt slid into place with a solid, definitive thud. Oliver faded in and out of consciousness for the rest of the night. Whenever he surfaced from the heavy, pain-induced stupor, Beatrice was there. She didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, her eyes moving relentlessly over the ledgers, her quills scratching out notes, building a paper gallows for the men who had tried to bury him. Dawn broke the storm. Thin gray light filtered through the heavy velvet drapes. The fire had burned down to embers. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered against the heavy oak doors of the bedroom. Oliver jolted his heart, hammering against his bruised ribs. The sudden movement sent fire shooting down his splinted leg. He groaned, biting the inside of his cheek to stifle the sound. Beatrice was already on her feet. She had discarded the nightgown, hastily dressing herself in a high-collared morning dress she must have ordered from her own chambers. It was stark black, devoid of lace or ribbon. She looked like an executioner. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice ringing clear and authoritative through the massive room. "It is Harris, your grace." The steward's voice was muffled by the thick wood. It sounded properly grave, dipped in artificial sorrow. "The house staff informed me of the tragedy. I came straight from the village. They say the doctor was turned away. I must insist on seeing his grace." Oliver felt his blood run cold. The man who had likely paid to have his carriage axle sawn in half was standing on the other side of the door, demanding entry to finish the job. He tried to push himself up on his elbows. His arms shook violently, his triceps screaming in protest. "He started, but she held up a hand, silencing him without looking away from the door. She walked to the desk, picked up the thickest ledger, and tucked it under her arm. Then she strode to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt back. She pulled the door open, but only a few inches blocking the gap with her body. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," Beatrice said. Her tone was conversational, chillingly polite. Oliver watched from the bed. He couldn't see Harris, but he could hear the scrape of the man's boots on the hallway floorboards as he tried to look past her. "Your Grace," Harris said, his voice oily. "A terrible tragedy. The whole estate is in shock. Is it true the footman said the Duke is not expected to live through the morning?" "The footman is a gossip," Beatrice replied flatly. "My husband rests." "I see." There was a pause, heavy with calculation. "My lady, given the severity of his Grace's condition, I must take immediate control of the estate's affairs. There are tenant rents due, timber contracts to sign. I require the keys to the master study." "You require nothing." "Pardon." Harris's polite veneer slipped, replaced by a patronizing edge. "Your Grace, you are distraught. This is men's business. The law dictates that in the event of the Duke's incapacitation, the law dictates—" Beatrice interrupted, her voice slicing through the air like a razor, "that the Duchess acts as the voice of her husband until breath leaves his body. And as of this moment, Mr. Harris, you are dismissed." Silence plummeted over the hallway. Dismissed?" Harris sputtered, a nervous, ugly laugh escaping him. "You cannot dismiss me, madame. I have served this family for 20 years. "And you have robbed it for at least 3, Beatrice countered. Oliver saw her shift her weight, bracing herself in the doorway. "Did you think we wouldn't notice the timber funds bleeding into your private accounts, Harris? Or the discrepancies in the grain yields? Wow, you are hysterical." Harris's voice dropped, growing thick and menacing. The deferential servant was gone. "Step aside, little girl. I need to see the Duke." Oliver heard the violent shove against the wood. Beatrice stumbled back a half step, the door swinging wider. Harris stood in the threshold, his face red, his eyes darting frantically toward the bed. He looked like a cornered rat. He saw Oliver lying there pale and battered, and took a step into the room. The pain in Oliver's chest vanished, replaced by a surge of pure primal adrenaline. This man was advancing on his wife. He didn't think about his broken ribs or his shattered leg. He reached out his hand, closing around the heavy brass candlestick on his nightstand. He hauled himself upward, ignoring the sickening tear of muscle and bone in his chest. "Harris!" Oliver rasped. His voice was wrecked scarcely more than a gravelly whisper, but it cracked through the room like a gunshot. Harris froze his boot hovering above the floorboards. He stared at the bed, the blood draining from his ruddy face. He looked at Oliver not as a dying man, but as a ghost returning from the grave. Oliver sat propped on one shaking arm, his chest heaving, the heavy brass candlestick gripped tightly in his other hand. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dried blood. He looked feral. He felt feral. Your Grace," Harris stammered, stepping backward. "I was told you were unconscious." "You were told wrong." Oliver breathed, his eyes locking onto the steward with lethal intent. "My wife gave you an order. Leave this house. If you're found on High Cross land in 1 hour, I will have the gamekeeper shoot you." Harris looked from Oliver's terrifying, sweat-drenched face to Beatrice, who stood clutching the ledger, her chin held high, looking every inch the avenging Duchess. The steward swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He took another step back, turned on his heel, and fled down the corridor. Oliver watched the empty doorway for a long second. Then the adrenaline evaporated, leaving nothing but the crushing reality of his injuries. His arm gave out. He collapsed back against the pillows, a choked cry of agony tearing from his lips. The room spun violently. He heard the door slam shut. The bolt slid into place. Beatrice was beside him in an instant. She pried the candlestick from his rigid, trembling fingers. Her breathing was ragged, her face pale. "You fool!" she hissed, though there was no real anger in it. "You absolute stubborn fool! You've torn your bandages." The smell of raw alcohol and iodine stung the air. Oliver lay flat on his back, his jaw clamped so tightly his teeth ached. The skin of his chest was a patchwork of purple and black bruises. The violent exertion of sitting up to confront Harris had torn the clumsy stitches Beatrice had placed in his shoulder during the night. She worked in silence, her hands swift and clinical. She soaked a cloth in pure alcohol and pressed it mercilessly against the reopened gash. Oliver flinched violently, a curse hissing through his teeth. "Christ, Beatrice, are you trying to finish Harris's job?" She didn't stop. She pressed harder, wiping away the fresh blood. "If I wanted you dead, Oliver, I would have let you bleed out in the mud. Hold still." She was abrasive, sharp. But Oliver noticed the fine tremor in her hands. He noticed the way she avoided his eyes, keeping her gaze fixed firmly on the wound. The confrontation at the door had terrified her. She had stood down a desperate man wielding nothing but an account book and sheer bluff. "He'll run." Oliver grunted, his breath hitching as she tightened a fresh linen binding around his ribs. "Let him," Beatrice said flatly. "The magistrate in the village is his cousin. He wouldn't have arrested him anyway, but Harris knows we have the ledgers. He knows we found the bribe in the stable. He'll take whatever coin he has stashed and flee to the continent. He's a coward." He cut the axle. "Yes." She tied the bandage off with a sharp tug. "And he nearly succeeded." She pulled back, dropping the bloody rags into the basin. She looked exhausted. The haughty Duchess armor had slipped again, leaving behind a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She braced her hands on the edge of the mattress, her head bowed, staring at the floorboards. Oliver watched her. The silence stretched thick and heavy with 3 years of unspoken resentments, assumptions, and cold cruelty. He had built a fortress of cynicism around himself to protect his pride from the greedy wife he thought he had purchased. It turned out the fortress was just a cage. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. The question felt clumsy, inadequate. Beatrice didn't look up. "Tell you what, Oliver?" "That your steward was stealing, I did. 2 years ago. You told me to go buy a new hat." The memory stung worse than the iodine. "I was dismissive." "You were a bastard," she corrected sharply, her head snapping up. Her dark eyes flashed with sudden raw anger. "You looked at me as if I was dirt on your boots. You paraded me around London like a prize mare you resented buying. Why would I ever bring you another problem so you could humiliate me again? Oliver swallowed. There was no defense. She was entirely right. Because it was your duty to the estate. My duty? Beatrice let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. She pushed herself away from the bed, wrapping her arms around her stomach. My duty was to look pretty host to your dreadful political dinners and ignore the fact that my husband couldn't stand the sight of me. I performed my duty flawlessly. She turned her back to him, walking toward the window. She pulled back the heavy drape, looking out at the rain-soaked grounds of High Cross. I heard you, Oliver said quietly. Beatrice stiffened. She didn't turn around. Last night, he continued the words, feeling heavy on his tongue. When you sent Arbuthnot away, when you found the ledgers, I wasn't unconscious. I was pretending. Her shoulders went rigid. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she slowly turned to face him. The betrayal on her face was a physical blow. You pretended, she whispered, her voice hollow. You lay there and let me think you were dying. You let me sit here and... She trailed off the memory of her crying over him, begging him to live clearly, hitting her. I thought you were looking for my money, Oliver admitted. It was the ugliest truth he possessed, and he handed it to her bare. When you went to the strongbox, I thought you were looking for the bearer bonds to steal before I died. I wanted to catch you. Beatrice stared at him. The silence was deafening. He watched the realization wash over her, the sheer depth of his distrust. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. Instead, a cold, weary resignation settled into her features. Of course you did, she said softly. She looked at him not with anger, but with an immense, unbridgeable pity. 3 years, Oliver, and you still think I am nothing more than my father's debts. She walked toward the door. Beatrice. He tried to sit up, but the pain pinned him to the mattress. Wait. She stopped with her hand on the iron bolt. She didn't look back. I was wrong, he said, the admission tearing out of his throat, raw and desperate. I was a blind, arrogant fool. You saved my life. You saved this estate. I owe you. You owe me nothing, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, her voice slipping perfectly back into the detached, aristocratic drawl she used in society. She slid the bolt back. Your steward is gone. Your ledgers are safe. I shall send a servant up with your tea. Do try not to tear your stitches again. The heavy oak door opened and closed. Oliver was left alone in the stifling heat of the sick room, staring at the ceiling, realizing that surviving the carriage crash was going to be the easy part. Earning back the wife he had spent 3 years throwing away would be the real agony. Recovery was not a noble, quiet affair. It was humiliating. It was the smell of stale sweat soaking into fresh linen, the indignity of a chamber pot, and the maddening, bone-deep itch of flesh knitting back together beneath tight bandages. For the first fortnight, Oliver lived in a haze of localized pain. The sharp agony in his chest mellowed into a dull, constant ache that punished him every time he drew a full breath. His leg, bound tight in its wooden splint, felt like a dead leaden appendage dragging him down into the mattress. But worse than the physical degradation was the isolation. Beatrice had meant exactly what she said. The day after he had confronted Harris, she vanished from his sick room. She replaced herself with Higgins, the aging stoic butler, who brought Oliver his meals, washed his back with rough, impersonal efficiency, and administered the bitter willow bark tea that had replaced the laudanum. Her Grace sends her regards. Higgins would say every morning, placing a stack of meticulously folded papers on the nightstand. She reports that the western tenant roofs have been repaired before the autumn rains, and the new grain contracts are finalized. Oliver would stare at the papers. They were written in Beatrice's sharp, slanted hand, columns of numbers, brief factual summaries, not a single wasted word, no inquiries about his health, no lingering scent of lavender and cold ash. She was running his duchy with a ruthless, flawless efficiency, and she was doing it entirely without him. He spent his days staring at the plaster ceiling, listening to the vast, empty house. Highcross Manor had never felt so large. He tracked the sun moving across the floorboards, counting the hours until he could hear the faint, rhythmic click of her boot heels on the hardwood in the hallway. She never stopped at his door. The footsteps would pass by purposeful and brisk heading toward the east wing where she had relocated her sleeping quarters. He was trapped in a prison of his own making. For 3 years he had built walls of ice between them. He had assumed she was a hollow calculating creature, and so he had given her nothing but a hollow calculating marriage. Now she was simply returning the favor, wrapping herself in the very indifference he had taught her. By the 3rd week, the absolute silence in his room became unbearable. "Higgins!" Oliver rasped one morning as the butler was clearing away an untouched plate of cold toast. "Your Grace, fetch me my cane." Higgins paused, his pale eyes dropping to the heavily splinted leg beneath the blankets. "Dr. Arbuthnot's replacement, Dr. Evans from the city, explicitly stated you are not to bear weight for another month, sir." "I am aware of the physician's opinion," Oliver said, pushing himself up on his elbows. His chest screamed in protest, but he ignored it. "Fetch the cane, Higgins, or I will crawl out of this bed and drag myself down the corridor." The butler hesitated, then bowed stiffly. He returned a moment later with a heavy silver-tipped walking stick. Getting out of bed was an exercise in pure agony. The blood rushed to his injured leg, throbbing against the healing bone with the force of a hammer. His breath hitched in his throat, turning into a low, animalistic grunt as his bare foot touched the cold floorboards. The room tilted. Dark spots danced in his peripheral vision. He gripped the head of the cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sweat beaded on his forehead, instantly soaking the collar of his nightshirt. "Shall I assist you, Your Grace?" Higgins asked, hovering anxiously. "No." Oliver took a step. The pain shot up his spine, sharp and breathless. He took another. It took him 10 minutes to reach the heavy oak door. He threw the bolt back with a trembling hand, the metallic clank echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stepped out into the corridor. The air here was cooler, smelling of beeswax and old dust. He moved slowly, dragging his left leg, leaning heavily on the cane. Every step was a negotiation with his own ruined body. By the time he reached the grand staircase, his muscles were trembling uncontrollably. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the marble foyer far below. It looked like the edge of a cliff. If you die, they win. Her voice echoed in his memory, the raw, desperate sound of it in the dark wreckage of the carriage. He gripped the mahogany banister. He began the descent. The door to the master's study was ajar. Oliver stood in the threshold, his breathing ragged, his nightshirt clinging to his back with cold sweat. His leg was on fire, a deep, throbbing agony that threatened to buckle his knee. But he didn't lean on the doorframe. He forced himself to stand straight. Beatrice was at his massive oak desk. She was surrounded by ledgers, maps of the estate, and stacks of correspondence. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows caught the stray wisps of dark hair that had escaped her severe practical bun. She wore a simple dark blue wool gown, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing pale skin smudged with black ink. She looked up at the sound of his heavy dragging footsteps. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed in her dark eyes. Her hand stilled on the parchment. Then the iron portcullis slammed down. Her expression smoothed into a mask of polite, detached inquiry. "Oliver," she said, her voice perfectly level. She set her quill down. "You should not be out of bed. The bone will not fuse properly if you agitate it." "The bone will heal as it heals," he said. His voice was hoarse from disuse. He stepped into the room. It felt alien to him. The faint scent of cigar smoke and old leather that used to dominate the study had been replaced by the sharp, crisp smell of sealing wax and her lavender soap. She had reorganized the shelves. The hunting trophies had been taken down, replaced by practical filing boxes. She had made it her domain. He didn't walk around the desk to take his heavy leather chair. Instead, he made his way to one of the small, uncomfortable visitor chairs positioned in front of the desk. He practically collapsed into it, his ruined leg extending stiffly in front of him. The cane clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Beatrice watched him, her eyes tracking the sweat on his brow and the grimace of pain he couldn't quite hide. She didn't offer to pick up the cane. She leaned back in the large chair, lacing her ink-stained fingers together, waiting. "I have reviewed your reports." Oliver began staring at the polished wood of the desk. The handling of the Western tenants, the renegotiation with the Millers. They were exceptional. They were necessary, Beatrice corrected coldly. Harris left the accounts in complete disarray to cover his tracks. The Millers were preparing to break their contracts. Someone had to manage the crisis while you convalesced. "I know." Oliver finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "And you managed it better than I have in 3 years." Beatrice's jaw tightened. She hated this. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders. She was prepared for his anger, his suspicion, his arrogance. She was not prepared for his concession. "Is there a purpose to this visit, Your Grace?" she asked formally. "I have 3 more lease agreements to review before supper." Oliver reached into the pocket of his dressing gown. His fingers closed around the heavy cold brass of the master key ring. It held the keys to the strong box, the estate archives, the London bank vaults. Everything. He pulled the ring out and placed it on the desk. He pushed it across the polished wood. The metal scraped softly, stopping inches from her hands. Beatrice looked down at the keys. She didn't touch them. She looked back up at him, her eyes narrowing with deep ingrained suspicion. "What is this?" "They are yours," Oliver said softly. "Not to hold while I am confined to a bed. Permanently. I sent for the solicitor this morning. I'm drawing up papers to grant you full legal co-signatory power over the High Cross estate." The silence in the study was absolute. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to hold its breath. Beatrice stared at him. A myriad of emotions warring beneath the surface of her composed face, shock, confusion, and finally a surge of raw, bitter anger. She stood up abruptly, the heavy chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Do you think this fixes it?" she demanded. The polite veneer shattered, exposing the jagged, bleeding wounds beneath. Her voice trembled, but not with sadness, with rage. "Do you think handing me a ring of brass keys erases 3 years of humiliation, Oliver? Do you think it makes me forget the way you sneered at me at the breakfast table, the way you told your friends at the club that you had purchased a beautiful, empty-headed doll?" Oliver flinched. The words felt like physical blows. He had said those things. He had wanted them to be true because it was easier to despise a transaction than to admit he was terrified of being vulnerable to a woman who only married him for money. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't think it fixes anything." "Then why—" She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. "Why the sudden change? Because I didn't let you die in the mud. Because I caught a thief you were too blind to see. You don't trust me, Oliver. You never have." "I was a coward, Beatrice." The admission fell from his lips before he could stop it. It was the absolute ugly truth. Beatrice froze. Oliver leaned forward, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs. He looked at her, truly. Looked at her. The dark circles under her eyes, the ink on her hands, the fierce, unyielding strength in her posture. "I was a coward." He repeated, his voice thick with regret. "I knew your father forced you into the marriage. I knew you didn't want me, and my pride couldn't stomach it. So I decided to punish you before you could punish me. I made you into a caricature of a greedy aristocrat in my mind, so I wouldn't have to feel the sting of your indifference." He reached out his hand, resting inches from hers on the desk. His fingers were scarred from the carriage wood, trembling slightly from the exertion of the walk. I don't expect you to forgive me." Oliver said, the cynicism stripped entirely from his voice, leaving nothing but a raw, desperate sincerity. "I don't expect you to suddenly play the loving wife. I just want you to stop hiding. I want the woman who dragged my bleeding body out of a carriage and threatened a doctor. I want the woman who audited a corrupt steward in the middle of the night. You are brilliant, Beatrice, and you belong in this chair just as much as I do." Beatrice stared at his scarred hand. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling beneath the dark wool of her dress. The walls she had built were thick, fortified by years of cold neglect. They wouldn't come down with one speech. But a crack had formed. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out. She didn't take his hand. She picked up the ring of keys. The metal clinked as she weighed it in her palm. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for the deception she had grown so accustomed to. She found none, only exhaustion pain and a terrifyingly open honesty. The Eastern Tenant Farms need a new irrigation system. Beatrice said, her voice quiet, the tremor completely gone. It will cost £300. I intend to pull it from the Hunting Lodge Maintenance Fund. Oliver let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. It was a test. She was dismantling his personal luxuries to fund the estate's practical needs. Do it, he said without hesitation. Beatrice slipped the keys into the deep pocket of her skirt. She looked down at his leg, then at the heavy silver-tipped cane lying on the floor. She walked around the desk. She didn't offer a sweet smile. She didn't offer absolution. She bent down, picking up the cane, and held it out to him. Come along, Oliver. She said, her tone reverting to a brisk, commanding efficiency, though the edge of ice had melted just a fraction. Higgins will have a fit if you die of exhaustion in my study. I will help you back to the stairs. He took the cane, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm, calloused from the quill. Thank you, he murmured. It was a small thing, a brutal limping walk back to a lonely bedroom. But as he leaned a fraction of his weight against her shoulder, smelling the sharp ink and the faint lavender, Oliver knew the war was over. Now they just had to navigate the peace. Winter descended on Highcross Manor with a sudden violent frost. The sprawling lawns turned brittle and white, and the Great Lake froze solid, reflecting the pale, overcast sky like a sheet of dirty iron. 4 months had passed since the wreckage in the mud. Oliver's body had healed, but it had healed differently. He walked with a permanent, pronounced limp, heavily reliant on the silver-tipped cane. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his face had softened, etched with new lines of chronic pain and a quiet, hard-earned humility. He stood by the window of the drawing room watching the snow fall. The heavy mahogany doors clicked open. Beatrice walked in, swathed in a heavy velvet traveling cloak lined with dark fox fur. The cold air clung to her, making her cheeks flush a deep, vibrant pink. The carriage is ready, she announced, pulling off her thick leather gloves. Oliver turned. His stomach tightened instinctively. It was the first time they were traveling together since the accident. The destination was trivial, a dinner party at the neighboring estate of Lord Harrington, an unavoidable social obligation to prove to the county that the Duke of Highcross was not in fact an invalid, and that the sudden departure of his steward was a matter of routine business. The carriage waiting in the courtyard was not the massive, heavy mahogany beast that had nearly killed them. It was a smaller, lighter brougham newly commissioned with reinforced iron axles and a completely different suspension. Still, it was a carriage. Oliver watched Beatrice carefully. Her face was a mask of perfect, aristocratic calm, but he noticed the way her fingers dug into the fabric of her gloves. He noticed the slight, rapid flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. "We don't have to go," Oliver said quietly. "I can send a rider. Tell them the weather is too treacherous." Beatrice stiffened. "We have canceled on Harrington twice, Oliver. To cancel again would be to admit weakness. The county needs to see us." "The county can go to hell," he replied smoothly, limping toward her. "I care about you, not them." The blunt admission still possessed the power to shock her. Even after 4 months of shared ledgers, quiet dinners, and a slow, cautious thawing of their relationship, she still braced herself for his coldness. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. The mask slipped just a little. "I am fine," she lied, her voice tight. "You are terrified," he countered gently. He stopped in front of her. "And so am I." Beatrice swallowed hard, breaking eye contact. "It is just a machine, Oliver. Wood and wheels. And the last time we were in one, I woke up with my ribs crushed and you were tearing your hands apart in the mud." He reached out, his scarred fingers gently touching the edge of her fur-lined hood. It is entirely acceptable to be afraid, Bee. It was the first time he had used the nickname since he had heard her scream it in the dark. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut. A shudder racked her thin frame, the sudden release of a tension she had been carrying for months. "I have nightmares." She whispered the words, tumbling out like a confession. "I hear the wood snapping. I feel the weight of the door. I wake up thinking I can smell the blood." Oliver didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it was over or that she was safe. He simply stepped closer, sliding his arms around her heavy cloak, pulling her against his chest. She resisted for a fraction of a second, her body rigid, unaccustomed to comfort. Then she collapsed against him. She buried her face in the lapel of his coat, her hands gripping his arms with bruising force. He held her tightly, ignoring the dull ache the pressure caused in his own healed ribs. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of lavender and cold winter air. They stood there in the silent drawing room for a long time, two broken people holding on to the only anchor they had left. "I will not let anything happen to you," Oliver murmured into her hair. "Not ever again." Beatrice let out a shaky breath, pulling back slightly to look at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but the terror had ebbed, replaced by the fierce, unyielding strength he had come to rely on. "You couldn't stop a carriage crash if you tried, Oliver." She said, a faint, watery smile touching her lips. The cynicism was there, but it was gentle, a shared joke between survivors. "You have a bad leg." Oliver laughed, a genuine deep sound that surprised them both. "True, but I have a very aggressive Duchess with a heavy ledger book. I pity the carriage that tries to cross her." Beatrice's smile widened. She stepped out of his embrace, smoothing the front of her cloak, the Duchess armor clicking back into place. But this time it felt like a shared uniform rather than a defense mechanism. "We should go," she said, her voice steady. "Harrington's soup is always cold if you're late." Oliver picked up his cane. He offered her his arm. She took it. Her grip was firm, grounding him as much as he grounded her. They walked out into the freezing courtyard. The new carriage stood waiting, the horses blowing plumes of white steam into the gray air. The coachman held the door open. Beatrice hesitated at the step. Oliver felt the tremor run through her arm. He placed his hand over hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Together," he said quietly. She looked at him, the fear in her eyes met and held by the unwavering certainty in his. "Together," Beatrice echoed. She stepped up into the carriage. Oliver followed his bad leg, complaining at the steep angle, but he pulled himself inside. The door shut with a solid, echoing thud. The carriage lurched forward. Beatrice grabbed the edge of the leather seat, her knuckles white. Oliver reached across the small space between them. He took her hand, prying her stiff fingers open, and laced his larger scarred hand through hers. He didn't let go. As they rolled down the long, winding drive of Highcross Manor, away from the ghosts of their past and into the biting winter wind, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a weapon forged in cold assumption. It was a shelter built on the solid, imperfect ground of a hard-won truth. They were not a fairy tale. They were scarred, cynical, and intimately acquainted with the ugly realities of the world. But as Beatrice's grip slowly relaxed in his leaning her head against the velvet squabs, Oliver knew that whatever wreckage came next, they would dig each other out. That brings us to the end of Oliver and Beatrice's journey, a story not of fairy tale romance, but of surviving the wreckage of their own pride. Love isn't always found in grand poetic declarations. Sometimes it's forged in the quiet terror of a carriage ride or the shared silence over a stack of corrupted ledgers. If their hard-won redemption moved you, please hit the like button, share this tale with someone who appreciates a grounded, gritty romance, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of flawed, unforgettable characters. Tell us in the comments what was your favorite moment of Beatrice's fierce rebellion. We'll see you in the next video.